The world of labels can be a pretty tricky thing, and honestly, with all of the micro labels and genres, it's easy to chalk any newfangled genre term that comes around as irrelevant or at least massively inconsequential, comparatively speaking, to other big genres that set the stepping stones for it to exist in the first place. So for such a rare phenomenon to happen, where a modern term, or at least a fairly modern term, in the metal community to not only flourish, but to have some pretty distinct staying power not only in publicity, but bringing tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people into not only metal, but extreme metal, has to be something worthwhile to talk about, and I'm of course referring to Blackgaze. It's the genre where black metal decided to have a fucking love affair with shoegaze and make a dripping, atmospheric, ethereal, effervescent sort of take on the two genres, bringing them together to create something that a lot of purist black metal fans were not too fond of. But I feel like a broken record when it comes to rough guides and trying to talk about the history of something, because I think a lot of times whenever a term comes around, people think it starts when it becomes popular, but you gotta think of it in a little bit more of a broader sense. Black metal and atmosphere had gone together pretty much like peaches and cream ever since the beginning. While black metal was very raw and lo-fi, I'll give you that, especially in like the mid to late 80s, the 90s and the 2000s were full of bands that were taking symphonic elements, that were taking atmospheric elements, and putting them together with black metal in a way that you could kind of classify at points, I will just say at points, as Blackgaze. Evil Feast, Bluedos Nord, Summoning, Burzum, The Ruins of Beverus, Nagura Bunget, these were all bands that in some capacity incorporated the concept of atmosphere in a very shoegaze way into their music. It just wasn't in the way that a lot of people thought it would be in the 2010s, when bands like Deafheaven and Alcest came around and took the metal world by storm. And while those are going to be big bands that are relevant to this discussion, there are a lot of other modern metal bands that take a lot of hints from shoegaze, from atmospheric music, from symphonic elements. I would say that White Ward's False Light was like this, Mirker, Bastonnage, even Altar of Plagues at points takes some of these things. But cut to the mid-2010s, you had Deafheaven release the crown jewel, the biggest achievement in many people's eyes of Blackgaze, being Sunbather, and this thing was like nothing that had ever been seen in recent memory from such an extreme metal band. And this had a lot of people conflicted, because on one hand you had people saying, wow, so many quote-unquote normies were getting into metal for the first time, and not only metal, but black metal, or at least a form of it. And considering up until that point, most of the time if a metal band bled into the mainstream, or at least the mainstream metal sphere, you could kind of see how it would be a bit more digestible, a little bit more commercially viable, and there weren't really many black metal bands that fit that criteria. And Deafheaven, while they are very pretty and well produced, gorgeously put together, having a lot of reverbed riffs and vocals that can sometimes be a little bit easier to comprehend than other contemporary black metal bands, they were still firmly placed in a lot of black metal spaces, regardless of how cleanly produced or cleanly put together they were. And the same could very much be said for a project like Alcest coming out of France, which kind of took what Deafheaven did, and they were contemporaries at the time, but told it in a little bit more of a black metal light. I don't think I have to be the one to tell you that black metal, pretty insulated. A lot of black metal fans do not like it when what they deem as posers come into it. And black metal has had a long-standing tradition of not liking experimentation if it's the wrong kind of experimentation. And for shoegaze, a genre that has its roots in things like indie and alternative rock, these are genres that a lot of black metal fans, especially the purists, the true cult mentality type of people, were not fond of whatsoever. Which I never particularly understood this sort of criticism of Deafheaven or Blackgaze as a whole, because if you really think about it, if it's getting more people into black metal, that makes more avenues and routes for people to find and adopt and like your projects, your bands, the things that you enjoy and cherish. We all gotta start somewhere down the rabbit hole, and I just have to say, you always gotta start somewhere. I don't expect new black metal fans to come out of the womb listening to the most lo-fi, atmospheric black metal music. Atmosphere and black metal have always mixed together. I don't think anyone can deny that black metal has always been lonesome, dejected, desolate, having some sort of coldness to the instrumentation, and so when you have a sort of stylistic origin that embodies that pretty much entirely, it's not hard to see why those two go together so well. But the big thing that a lot of people got kind of confused with, and still to this day sometimes have trouble defining, is what exactly is the difference between atmospheric black metal metal and blackgaze, because they can oftentimes take forms that are a little bit familiar, if not similar to one another, and so I'll try to explain it to the best of my ability. Atmospheric black metal is almost always one of two things: either the riffs taking on more of an atmospheric take with slower compositions, more melody, putting more harmonious rhythmic elements into the instrumentation, or alternatively putting some sort of synth in the mix to balance out the harshness of the rest of the instrumentation. These ice cold wintry synths that will come into a composition and layer in the backdrop to make some sort of environment that swallows you whole and consumes you in this feeling of lonesomeness. You'll still have the signature blast beats, the shrill vocals. Most of the time it will be pretty in your face, and it will still feel brittle. It can still be very lo-fi, it can still be low produced. Blackgaze, on the other hand, takes some of those indie and alt-rock influences and puts them into black metal in a way that can make some more expansive compositions, things that feel slower, things that feel more well-paced out, not always having to be so harsh, not always having to be so bone thin. And instead of synths and riffs making atmospheric black metal what it is, blackgaze feels more like a full body experience, where every single thing is a cog in the wheel that intentionally is trying to make something feel intergalactic and out there, distant and illuminescent. And this kind of goes hand in hand with, I'm sure that they exist, and I'm not the most like well versed in it, but I will say I don't think I've ever heard a lo-fi blackgaze project. It is very much deliberate that the compositions are well produced, well put together, very meticulous and tangible, everything feeling like it has its space in a mix. And for a lot of black metal fans that like their music to not feel too touched up, this can sap some of the organic sort of uniqueness that black metal fans feel from blackgaze. And I'm also going to say that there is a little bit of gatekeeping when it comes to black metal coming out of America. Sometimes black metal from America just gets a bad reputation. I'm just going to be honest. Bands like Profanatica and Wolves in the Throne Room are fantastic projects, but I have seen black metal fans just not really want to adopt it because they like the European strain more, and that's perfectly fine, to each their own, but I wanted to mention that because it is important to the development of it. And one of the biggest complaints I oftentimes saw is it's just a bunch of American posers trying to come into black metal and water it down and desaturate it, which that is up to your own discretion whether you want to agree with that or not. Me personally, I don't care. There's plenty of great American black metal projects. But to move on to my next point, we are going to talk about the blackgaze normifying. It's well known at this point that anytime you get an influx of a lot of people enjoying a metal genre for the first time, or a metal band that isn't entirely just metal and nothing else, you're going to catch some flack. It happened with nu metal, it happened with alt metal, it happens with rap metal, it happens with fucking like bands like Sleep Token nowadays. Like, it's nothing new, and blackgaze isn't the first, nor will it be the last genre to fall prey to that. But the difference with blackgaze, and the reason it's such a fascinating genre to sort of examine looking over like a puppeteer, is you never really saw a genre that was influenced by something so harsh bringing so many people in. You had publications praising the ever-living fuck out of projects like New Bermuda and Sunbather, especially from Deafheaven. You had massive reviewers, some of the biggest ones like Anthony Fantano, singing its praises. And similar to how kind of Liturgy blew up very fast and then garnered a lot of doggy piling, you kind of also had the split coin where there were a lot of people getting into it and being like, I just don't like real black metal, but I like this. And that pissed a lot of people off because it felt like you weren't allowed in the cool kids club because you were disrespecting the reputation of a genre. You were talking down to it. You were not enjoying the real shit. People could maybe appreciate it if you were going down the rabbit hole and you ended up listening to the bigger bands, but kind of similar to how a lot of people don't consider Cradle of Filth or Dimmu Borgir the realest black metal bands, you can imagine what they did to Deafheaven. And honestly, it's not hard to see why blackgaze not only blew up really fast, but hit a massive downward sort of trend, where nowadays you don't really hear that many blackgaze bands making waves, and with projects from Alcest and Deafheaven really kind of, I won't say flopping, but not doing as well or not being as good of albums as their peak, and bands coming around being few and far between and more so taking influence from blackgaze, blackgaze is no longer sort of the zeitgeist in metal that it once was. And I don't think it's because the genre was put down or ridiculed. I don't think that's ever stopped a genre in the past when it comes to metal, so I would not chalk it up to that. What I would mostly say is it was a micro-genre, and just because a few bands blew up from it does not mean that it was ever anything more than just a micro-label within micro-labels. And with so few bands being able to catch that stride in the same way, people are going to clamor for new bands, and the intrigue is going to fade because they're not going to get that same itch they scratch as when they heard it for the first time, because that's going to be a big deal. When you hear something that is unique, brand spanking new, never been done before, it's going to catch some ears and eyes. People are going to be like, have you heard about this band Deafheaven? Have you heard this record Sunbather? It changed my life. It changed how I saw metal. Of course, when you have Blackgaze band number 52 in the underground with 100 listeners, they might make music that is good if you are a diehard, but the quality is not going to be the same. And for a genre to succeed, you need to not only have bands that are willing to experiment and push things out of its comfort zone and the boundaries, but you also need a plethora of bands and projects that are able to maintain that upward momentum, because when you have such an influx of people coming into your project and to your subgenre so rapidly and being ravenous for more material, you have to have the supply to meet that demand. And I unfortunately don't think that Blackgaze did, because I've always really liked atmosphere and music, so when Blackgaze came around, I was pretty hyped that there was a genre that took something I already liked, black metal, and took something else I really liked, atmospheric music, and put them together, but I just rarely could find many projects that lived up to that initial hype. It's kind of that quote where people say, I wish I could wipe my brain so I could see this movie or TV show for the first time again. I think that sort of watching a car crash mentality that people had when Blackgaze first came around and got all of this acclaim and publicity, it sort of obviously was going to die down because it just wasn't going to have the same lasting power, because the confinements of Blackgaze are pretty minimal. You can't really do much with two genres being brought together that are pretty static and stagnant. It's not like metalcore, where heavy metal and hardcore punk are very wide, diverse genres. Black metal music and atmospheric music, specifically shoegaze, are pretty homogenous. A lot of black metal blends in with each other, and a lot of shoegaze music definitely blends in with each other. So when you take two genres that are already pretty idiosyncratic and pretty homogenous in the way that they come across, and you merge them together, combined with hundreds of thousands of people checking you out for the first time, you are absolutely going to have that downward trend, whether you like it or not, unless you have some way to innovate the genre. And up until this point, that has not really happened with Blackgaze music. But it still is a very cool cultural point for heavy metal, because I think it shows that under the right pretense, any extreme genre can garner some sort of acclaim and normie appeal or be digestible for a larger audience. And I think it's very telling of how experimentation can boost your band to greater lengths and literally create subgenres out of thin air that, whether or not you still listen to it or not, are pretty impressive for what they are able to accomplish within such an idiosyncratic style. And Blackgaze might now be a little bit of a blip on the radar that isn't nearly as big as it once was. It still had its moment in the limelight, and I think it is very important to examine for any subgenres, genres, or bands or projects that come around in the future. What are your guys' opinions of Blackgaze? Do you enjoy it? Do you not? Did you like it at the time? Do you have your criticisms of it? You can discuss it in the comment section below. There is no wrong answer. Be sure to like this video if you enjoyed it, subscribe to join the review family today, and smash that notification bell to be notified of my future uploads. You know who it is. My name is Jay Morris, and I'm signing off saying farewell.